They're like buses, they come on every 20 minutes. All right, well, I think we'll actually be going. My name is Pat Egan. Thank you all for coming and for doing this. This is Eric Clark. Eric Clark is going to give us a pretty interesting study that he's been at for a number of years, and he'll give you some background about it. It's indicative, you'll find, of the changes that we're going through in terms of our weather, that we are all anecdotally feeling and seeing. He's going to give some substance to all of that. So that, Eric?
Hi. Thanks a lot for coming, and I want to thank Pat and folks for inviting me to talk. So a little bit about myself. I'm a wildlife ecologist by training. I'm currently the director of the Sault Ste. Tribe of Chippewa Indians Natural Resource Department. I am not a member of the tribe, however, my wife and my two daughters are Sault Tribe members. We have, our how many folks are from Sault Ste. Marie? Okay. So are folks familiar with Sault Tribe or not really familiar with Sault Tribe? So I'll give a little bit of background about Sault Tribe just to sort of set some of the context. But I really want to talk about, we do a lot of work with climate change assessment. My personal sort of passion and research interest outside of my professional career as a Natural Resource Department director and sort of as an academic researcher, I'm really interested in connections between climate, species, and habitat, and population performance, and sort of how do you actually sort of tease out what's the impact of climate, what's the impact of like changing landscapes and managing landscapes certain ways, and that's a really complicated thing to do. And I'll talk a little bit about how Sault Tribe is framing those problems, how we're arriving at the questions that we want to ask, and how we're going about asking those questions. I'll try to keep this. As a wildlife ecologist, my tendency is to get really excited about things like detection probabilities, and I'll try to keep that stuff out of there because, I'll talk a lot about trapping animals and what we do with them when we trap them. So I titled this talk 20,000 Trap Nights, and so that's a little bit of jargon. So if you're not familiar with what you consider a trap night, when we're talking about trapping effort from a biological assessment perspective, one trap night is one trap in the woods for one night. That equals one trap night. So since 2013, maybe 2012, the Sault Ste. Tribe of Chippewa Indians Wildlife Program has logged over 20,000 trap nights in the eastern UP, catching animals, radio collaring animals, doing all those things that we do with animals. And so I think we've learned a whole lot about snowshoe hare and marten and their connection to habitat. But I think as much as we've learned about them, we probably have a lot better questions that we're asking now than we started asking. I think anytime you're working in science, I think anybody who's done field assessments will tell you got the good question to ask after you spent all this time trying to answer the bad question to ask in the first place. So, anyways, I also think that this talk is just a really good excuse to share a whole bunch of really cool pictures that we've taken over the last 4 or 5 years. So I'll say all these pictures in this presentation are pictures from our program. So I will say I'm really I feel really lucky to be able to do this stuff for a living, and I think these pictures will sort of test how cool the job I have. So anyways, just a little overview. I want to talk a little bit about Sault Tribe's Natural Resources Department, our approach to wildlife management. I'll talk about why we're working on snowshoe hare and American marten, and then I'll just sort of give you I don't know if to call it maybe 1,000-foot view of our marten and snowshoe hare assessments, and feel free to ask questions along the way. So, Sault Tribe's, our wildlife program is, we're very focused on developing adaptive management approaches to wildlife management and working with other agencies to sort of collaborate and develop these approaches. And I'll talk a little bit in depth about what I mean about adaptive management. And so there's, how many of folks have heard of the term adaptive management use? It's a pretty commonplace thing. And you know, like adaptive management can mean anything from, well, we're going to try this, and if it doesn't work, we're going to try something else. When we talk about adaptive management, what we're really talking about is adaptive management in the most rigorous sense. And so, trying to deal with, you know, dynamic natural resource systems that, you know, you can't ever predict what's going to happen when you design a prescription. And so, what we're really interested in doing is developing alternative hypotheses behind different management prescriptions. So if you want to do a better job managing snowshoe hare habitat on the forest when you do timber harvest, it's adaptive management says, well, we're going to do these 4 things, and then we're going to intensively monitor how these populations respond to these 4 things, and we're going to use that to do more alternative management prescriptions, and we're going to evaluate those. And so when I talk about that, we're talking about it in the most rigorous sense. You know, and I think the important thing to remember about that is you really need to know a lot about these species in the outset to ask the right questions about how to design these management prescriptions. So a lot of our focus in these last 4 years with Marten and snowshoe hare has really been about understanding that baseline condition, understanding sort of the basic building blocks of how they use habitat and sort of those functional linkages between habitat quality and population performance. So the other thing that that we're really focused on is we're a tribal natural resource department. Members of Sault Ste. Marie Tribe, long before there was ever a Sault Ste. Marie Tribe, were from Sault Ste. Marie. They have tons of local knowledge. There is a lot of traditional knowledge walled up in the kinds of things people harvest, the way that they harvest them, the places they harvest them, and the times they harvest these species. And so adaptive management, it's well documented in all sorts of literature. It's a very effective framework for taking things other than Western science and trying to incorporate those in the way that you manage for these species. And so that's a really big goal of ours is understanding community preferences, community understandings of what good snowshoe hare habitat is or what good marten habitat is, the way that they want to harvest these species and the way that they've harvested these species for thousands of years. How do we incorporate those into the way that we manage these species and the kinds of prescriptions that we work for in terms of habitat? The other thing about the adaptive management framework is it really works well in our management context, and that I'll explain a little bit about that. So unlike on the Great Lakes, the Sioux Tribe is one of the 5 signatory tribes to the 1836 treaty in Michigan. On the Great Lakes, the tribes in the state are equal co-managers. In other words, decision making about all that stuff if you were in here before, you heard about managing Atlantic salmon, managing all those species. Sault Tribe is one of the decision makers in how that stuff is managed. On the inland side, which is a different consent decree, a different allocation agreement, we don't have legal co-management authority, and so it's really the adaptive management framework is really a way for us to try to build support with partners, develop the data that it takes to manage these species, and to really try to improve harvest or improve improve management for key species across the 1836 ceded territory, which this is, if you're not familiar with it, the red line there is the 1836 ceded territory. And just to give you an idea of when I talk about, why it's important for us to manage outside of just the eastern UP, all those gray dots, one dot equals one person in Sault Tribe. So Sault Tribe is the largest tribe east of Mississippi. So, we're not just focused on the eastern UP, we're focused on the whole 1836 ceded territory. And so this adaptive management framework helps us build data sets here in the eastern UP that can affect, the way lands are managed across the whole 1836 ceded territory. I'm gonna skip right through that. I kind of just outside. So I'll get sort of the good stuff. So Waboos and Wabijishi so Waboos is translated as rabbit in Anishinaabe-Moan, which is the indigenous Anishinaabe language, and Wabijishi is the word for American Marten. One thing I think is really important. So Waboos is always, if you read anything that it's translated as rabbit, and if you're from around here, I'm sure you've seen that before. That Waboos means rabbit in Anishinaabe-Moan. But Waboos doesn't really mean rabbit; it means snowshoe hare. And I think that's really important. The Anishinaabe cultures are very connected to boreal transition biomes, the forests that are here and the species that are here, and so it's really, I think it's really one of the reasons that we really work on Marten and snowshoe hare is that connection that tribal culture has with these species. Both species are clan animals in tribal, I guess culture, and that's sort of a traditional system of understanding sort of family relations, and it's tied to, depends on who you talk to, it's tied to either the patriarchal side of the family or the matriarchal side of the family. But needless to say, both of these species are really important. They rise to importance. Both play really important roles in Anishinaabe creation stories. So stories about the way that the world was formed, about the way the world works. Both of these species play very prominent roles. The snowshoe hare is, tied to stories about how the birch bark got its black scars, about, I can't think of other ones. There's a whole plethora of stories about these. So I think it's really important when we start talking about climate change and these species going away for cultures that aren't, for me as a non-tribal member, I think we often think about like, we don't have snowshoe hares and we should start thinking about managing for some other kind of rabbit. Maybe we should be thinking about cottontails, or we have these conversations. We talk about fish and game management from a outside that cultural perspective. We often think about, are we managing for this or that? I just want to point out that these specific species, it's these species that are important, not rabbits. It's not rabbits that are important to creation stories. It's snowshoe hare. The other thing is they're both very important traditional subsistence species and fur species. Tribal members harvest annually around, Sault Tribe members, I should say, harvest around 1,000 snowshoe hares, primarily in eastern UP, because you have a hard time using snowshoe hare as a subsistence species in the northern lower because there's just hardly left down there for the most part. And roughly about 50% of the Marten harvest in the eastern Upper Peninsula it's Sault Tribe member trapping harvest. And so, it's not just that they're important sort of in a historic traditional perspective. They're contemporarily important to tribal members, and they help define tribal culture, contemporary tribal culture. Oftentimes when we think about tribal culture, we think about digging up, I see this all the time on the Forest Service documents. documents or state mission documents. Not to be derogatory towards them or anything, but like there's no culturally significant site found on this forest stand or these things. But you know, the tribe would contend that anytime we have tribal hunters out there using these lands and using these species, they're culturally important right now. So the other thing about these two species is they're both really ecologically important. Outside of all, you know, take away all those pieces and the connections to the tribal culture, they're important, you know, as right now. You know, snowshoe hare I would argue that they're probably the most vital prey species in the Northwoods. You know, and a lot of times, you know, the linkage between snowshoe hare and Canada lynx is really well documented. You know, most people have heard about that. But I think when you really read literature about the kinds of things that prey on snowshoe hare and the kinds of things that they're important to, and the kinds of things that the snowshoe hare, you know, those 10-year cycles actually drive in the Northwoods, it's really astonishing. Does anybody know what the top predator of juvenile snowshoe hare are?
Cougars.
No?
Hunters?
Red squirrels. And so there's lots of research out there that shows that there are demographic cycles in red squirrel populations, and especially as you go north, that are directly related to that snowshoe hare cycle. And so why is that? You know, snowshoe hare have 3 litters a year on average, 2 to 3. On average, they have between 7 and 9 leverets in those litters. That is a lot of biomass that snowshoe hares put out in the woods, especially when they're at peaks. You know, and one of the really common misconceptions, and I hear this all the time, and it's like a really big pet peeve of mine, is people say, the foxes are up and now the hares are down. And it is precisely the opposite. So snowshoe hares in that prey availability drive predator assemblages. Snowshoe hare essentially eat themselves out of house and home, you know, especially as you go further north. Down here it's a little more complicated because you got a much more complex suite of predators. But as you go north, you know, snowshoe hares don't, you know, Canada lynx don't cause declines in snowshoe hare populations. It's precisely the opposite. Declines in snowshoe hare populations tend to drive declines in Canada lynx populations. Like I said, there's some caveats to that, and it's pretty complicated. You know, American marten are a very important indicator of ecological health in Northwoods. I'll talk a little bit about this, but you know, they're a prey generalist. They'll eat anything. So we've done a lot of work with marten den sites, and if you ever find a marten den in a tree and walk around the ground, it's like a killing field of everything that's a prey species in the woods. I mean, they will eat anything, and so you know, that makes them as that type of predator. It makes them an important indicator of sort of what's going on in those woods. So, I'm not going to talk a lot about climate change itself, actually. I'm assuming probably, you know, folks have heard lots about climate. Climate models are really boring. And I'll talk about this at the end, I actually don't think it's, you know, I think climate change is important. I don't think that whether or not climate is causing changes in species is all that important as in terms of what we're asking in terms of questions. But I do, you know, I think both of these species are impacted by climate change, and our, you know, projections are not good for them in terms of those climate impacts. So, you know, both are adapted to deep snows and cold temperatures. You know, if you've ever held a marten fur, you can tell that they can handle some, you know, they can deal with some cold. They're very, you know, there's a reason people like to track them. Their fur is very nice, it's very fluffy. They can handle very cold temperatures. They have really big pad size to weight ratio in their feet, just like a snowshoe hare. They've got those big old feet. They're well adapted to running on snow. You know, one of the things, you know, Marten and Fisher, their ranges tend to overlap. Fisher are very different. They've got a smaller foot compared to their body weight. They do not do as well in deep snow as an American Marten does. So, the other thing too is that they're very, and I mentioned this earlier, like the Anishinaabe people, Marten and Snowshoe Hare are really dependent on those boreal transition forest types. This is my one climate change slide. So this stuff is all from Stephen Handler et al.'s Michigan Forest Ecosystem Vulnerability Assessment and Synthesis. If you haven't seen this document and you would like it, it's free online, and it's produced by the Northern Institute for Applied Climate Science. It's probably the best synopsis of accessible climate information for the Northwoods, and it does a very good job of talking about impacts on the forest communities in the eastern UP and the North Peninsula. So I don't think any of this stuff is probably it's not earth-shattering to anybody here. So, temperatures are projected to increase during the next century. Dramatic warming in the winter, I think it's really important. Snowfall is expected to decline across the assessment area. That's talking about this the vulnerability assessment, not our assessment area. Although they align pretty darn close. More winter precipitation is rain. So for species like Snowshoe Hare and American Marten that have life history strategies that are tied to living in deep snow conditions, having less snow is a problem. If you look at I try to just sort of pull out a statement out of this report that I think kind of embodies some of the changes that we're looking at here. All these climate models seem to agree that boreal and northern species are going to decline over time. And so this, I think this is really important to then understand, well, how are these species connected to these different, to the actual vegetation community here? And so I'll get into sort of some of the questions we're asking about that in a little bit. So one of the things that we're interested in doing is just sort of understanding, if we talked to the tribal community and said, what species are really important? Those are probably really hard to read. So the two important ones here, though, I think are American Marten and Snowshoe Hare. So what we did with this is there's a whole project behind this, a whole complicated vulnerability assessment process. We developed 3 panels of 15 experts from across the upper Midwest on all these species, and we sort of sat down with them and assessed vulnerability on 36 different criteria, timing, like phenology and timing, and habitat vulnerability and physiological vulnerability, all sorts of things. And we just said, okay, well, let's look at, like, if we were to take the important species for Sault Tribe members and figure out, if we're going to do work on climate change, what should we be working on? You can see that Snowshoe Hare and American Marten are up here on the high end of the spectrum for vulnerability. One of the things you'll see is there's sort of these cloudy, I was trying to figure out a way to show this, hopefully this works, but one of the things about this is that, and maybe it's that as biologists we're conditioned to really put a lot of caveats on something when we say that it's climate vulnerability because we don't want to get into a political debate about climate change. But I think one of the things you see there, what those sort of glowing areas are, is those are the sorry, I'm getting distracted by the guitar over there. I'm trying to assess there. What I'm trying to show is the uncertainty of those vulnerability scores. And so, one of the things you'll see is, yes, this panel of 15 people said these are really vulnerable, but there's a lot of uncertainty as to how vulnerable those species are. And that's because when we do, a lot of the research that has been done on wildlife, connections to habitat is really correlational research. There's not a lot of cause and effect research. Well, that's good habitat there because we found a lot of snowshoe hares there. We don't really know why they're there. We don't know what drives the fact that there's a lot of snowshoe hares. We don't know what those functional linkages between population performance and habitat quality is, or what the actual measure of habitat quality we should be focused on is. So these are the sort of questions that are really driving all this snowshoe hare assessment work that we're doing. And what you'll see is that we're really not measuring climate at all in any of these things. What we're trying to do is build those baseline relationships to, how do American marten use vegetation? How do they, how are they, what drives non-harvest mortality of marten? So with that, I'm going to kind of launch into a discussion about just our American marten work. And like I said, it's going to be kind of the 1,000-foot view of what we're doing. Before I go, does anybody have any questions about any of that? I just blew a bunch of stuff at fire hose. What's up?
I want to ask you a basic question. I know the answer to this one, but I forgot. Which came first, the snowshoe hare or the invention of the snowshoe? Go ahead and turn now. Which is
I'm assuming the snowshoe hare taught people how to make a snowshoe, right? So this is just a list of all the assessment.
What about the naming of the snowshoe hare?
Well, that's a great, I don't know.
Obviously, the species.
Yeah.
The naming of or the invention?
Good question. I don't know.
No, we don't know.
I can tell you how to catch one. So this is, I'm going to talk about American marten first, and then I'll talk about snowshoe hare. Since 2012, these are all the assessments that we've done. So we've done just basically went out and tried to count these things and do abundance estimates. I guess I should back up. A lot of this stuff that we're, when I think about our program, what I'm really trying to do is combine sort of cutting edge survey techniques and technology with traditional ecological knowledge and really try to do innovative things with those things. So I think a lot of the things you'll see that we're working with are, I think they're very innovative. So doing abundance estimates, with those we use passive integrated transponder tags. Brought some handouts. Pass those around. Those are pit tags. Passive integrated transponder. They use them on all sorts of things. That's what if you get your dog microchipped, that's what they put in. It's a passive integrated transponder tag. So for a long time, folks put, they use ear tags and different types of marks on animals. Now we inject those under their skin. Put it under their skin. The wound heals in a couple days. We can clean it. We can put antibiotic on it. It's much better on the animal than having an ear tag or something like that.
The predator that eats that animal, how that doesn't just get that in their body?
Well, they probably do, but I'm sure they just pass it. It's so small. Most of the time it gets embedded in the fat, and it sits between the skin and the muscle. I don't think it bothers them at all. Kind of like your dog. I mean, when you put that tag in your dog, those things migrate all over the animal. You don't ever know where that microchips actually end up. So we've also done a lot of work with home range and using VHF collars. And I brought a couple of these in. The one caveat behind these is they kind of smell really bad because they spent like 2 years on the animal out in the woods. So I'll pass those around. These are VHF radio collars. Now to get a actual reading on those, we got to go out there with an antenna and actually find the animal. So we've done den site characteristics and juvenile dispersal. So looking at what are the requirements for females in den sites, and then when do the kits leave home? So we kind of know that at some the kits kind of hang around the den. They have litter sizes of 2 to 3 typically, and so the kits will just be kind of hanging around then. And then at some point in the year they kind of just disappear. And so we wanted to sort of investigate those things. We looked at serosurveys, hematology, and causes of mortality. So really looking at blood chemistry and blood diseases and things like that in Marten. And then, you know, of all these Marten that are out there, you know, what are, you know, so we spent a lot of time collecting Marten that died with the radio collar on and having necropsies done on them to figure out what causes these things. What are the then non-harvest mortality estimates is something else that's very important. To my knowledge, there's very little data out there on non-harvest mortality estimates, and we've got a PhD student that's finishing up a dissertation right now that worked with us on trying to understand what kills Martens besides trappers. We also looked at, we've got a master's student who just finished up doing resource selection modeling with GPS collars. I'll pass these around too. These are a little different animal. These actually store and download a location. So you put the collar out, animals out there running around every 15 minutes, that thing fires up and snaps a point. And so these things, there's one of the big limitations with American Marten is, you know, the guidelines, the American Society of Mammalogists guidelines for radio collaring animals is that you should keep the collar less than 3% of the animal's body weight, which 3% is really significant. Think about, you know, if you were to hang a 9-pound weight around your neck and go climb around the trees for a while, you know. So we stick very, very strict to that 3% rule. So a lot of the Marten that we've captured over the years, we couldn't actually radio collar because they just weren't heavy enough. And so the battery life on those GPS collars is only about 2 weeks. But the important thing is you get very accurate points with those, and we collect more data in 2 weeks with those than we do in 2 years with a radio collar. You've got to go out and actually go out and find it. And so those are pretty cool things, and I'll talk a little bit about sort of some of the take-homes from those. So just a little bit of key stats about our Marten work. Since 2013, we've radio collared and GPS 72 Marten in the eastern UP. We've captured over 150. But like I said, a lot of those are they're just not big enough to radio collar. So a lot of the average weight of a female Marten usually runs in the 7 to 1,000 gram range, and with those collars, the smallest Marten we can collar is 833 grams. So a lot of the female Marten we catch are too light to capture. And then we catch a lot of juveniles too, especially at certain times of the year when they're just not, they're not big enough for that. One key thing about those collars, the radio collars I passed out first cost about $180 a piece. Those ones, the GPS collars, cost about $1,500 a piece. So there's a pretty significant, So when we put out 12 GPS collars, it's a lot of money. We got to run around in fancy necklaces in the woods. And the other thing about those too is to get both of those things back, you got to catch the animal again. And so it's a lot of work catching 72 Marten. It's a heck of a lot more work catching 72 Marten again. And so, for instance, our first summer GPS collaring, I think it took us 2,000 trap nights to capture 12 Marten, and it took about 5,000 to get them back. So, it takes there's a lot of work involved in these things. So, like I said, we've collected literally hundreds of VHF locations, thousands of GPS locations. We've funded, the data out of all our Marten work has produced 3 master's theses and 2 PhD dissertations. We've published peer-reviewed journal articles on health and genetics and den site selection, and probably a slew of other ones, that'll be coming up soon. A lot of these things we don't have, after 4 years, we're just now getting this data back so we can really start, answering these bigger questions. The other thing I want to point out is we we couldn't do all this stuff without a really effective group of partners. We work a lot with wildlife veterinarian named Maria Spriggs from Busch Gardens in Florida, actually. She's fantastic, and everything I know about anesthetizing wildlife, she taught me. So, and then we've got a very strong cooperative working agreement with the Hiawatha National Forest, Michigan State University, the University of Tennessee, and Grand Valley State University have all had grad students requested to do the work. I'll talk real quick about just our trapping process. So with Marten, we trap them with just tomahawk cage traps. We use meat for bait. This is a trap in the winter. We've got hundreds of these buckets that we cut in half, and we've got essentially dig a tunnel out in the snow, put some stuff under it to keep the trap from melting down in the snow, and put a bucket over top of them, because even though they're really able to stay warm, Marten are really big wimps, can't get wet. So if you have an exposed Marten in the winter that gets wet, it'll be dead when you get there to the trap. So it's really important to keep, they're really good at staying dry out there in the woods. So that's really important. This is a summer set right here that you can see. It's just an old log, and we just shove that trap in there. They're very industrious. They will find every way to get that bait out of the trap without going in the trap. It's like I've had lots of week-long battles with one Marten that keeps coming to one trap and finding a way to get the meat out of it without getting in the trap. So it's amazing that what they'll do is I've actually had one push the trap out from under, dig back here and push the trap out of the bucket, eat the meat out of it, and sleep under the bucket. It was like a perfect So that's about as rude as it gets. So this is we've got here's another, that's just a Marten in the live trap there. Make no mistake, that thing looks really cute, but it is trying to bite you. they're pretty vicious little creatures. So we anesthetize them with isoflurane and inhalant gas, which is a pretty recent sort of thing with those. For a long time they used a drug dose of ketamine and xylazine, which the problem with that is it takes 4 hours for that Marten to come back around. You got to give it 2 doses of drugs. Isoflurane's an inhalant. You give it gas, and as soon as you take it off, it's starting to wake up. So depending on how long we have it, you can also maintain them essentially as long as you want, as long as you can keep their body temperature and their vital rates safe. It's the same thing the vet uses when you take your dog in, essentially. So we've got this specialized handling cone. I almost brought it in, but I didn't want it to seem too much like show and tell. What it is it's essentially a cone, and you can kind of see it in this picture. We're attaching it right up here. It's a fabric cone that attaches to the trap, and what we do is we get the animal in the trap, and we've got a zip tie on the trap. You attach that on, you pull it off, and it's a cone about this long, and it pinches down to a hole about that big. And the Marten, every time they'll shoot out of there and try to get out of that hole, and we just kind of squeeze them down into there. And you can see in this picture, the Marten has shot down the cone. He's squeezing the Marten there, and you just put the gas over the end of it, and then once knocked out, you unzip it and pull them in. So just once we get them, we always weigh them, measure them, determine sex, give them a passive integrated transponder tag, and then either give them a radio collar or a GPS collar. The GPS collars are a little heavier than the radio collars. So it's just like some interesting take homes, I guess, from our work. They're really hard to count. Like I said, they're really hard to capture, even harder to capture or recapture. One of the things about all the habitat work we've done is that it's really about complexity. They need structural diversity, they need species diversity, and I think we're just now starting to answer some of those questions now. And I think the other thing is they partition habitat at really defined scales, even though they use these big, they've got 3 square mile home ranges. The way they search that home range is really log by log by tree by tree. They're not like a it's not like a wolf that just sort of all over the place. They kind of, they know right where they're going. They search logs, they search holes, and so that makes it really hard to do things like planned forest management prescriptions for an animal that you got to think about how many dead logs are in here and how many crevices and cracks can they go in. And I think the other thing is, like I said, their home range is from the radio collar work we've done is between half a mile and 3 square miles on average. And I think the other thing is they'll eat anything you put in a trap. We trap them with meat, but last year in the summer we caught 4 marten in snowshoe hare traps that were baited with apples and cinnamon. So, anyways, I just want to give a sense of what this GPS collar data looks like. So this is actually 4 different marten right here that we've got, or I'm sorry, 5 different marten. There's 3 here. So what's really interesting is this green one here is a female, and this is a male, and this is a male. So they defend territories, and you can see they kind of butt right up against each other, and they don't, very little overlap. Some of the really cool stuff you can do with these GPS collars is really look at, you can compare 2 different martens. So this is one marten and its movements. So as it gets redder, it's spending more time in a certain spot. So it's really cool stuff. But what's really neat about these marten here is that at one point we have GPS points where they're 3 meters apart at one time, which is really interesting. I think about I wonder what that interaction was like. So they're staring at each other through a tree. So guys, that's our marten stuff in a nutshell. Anybody have questions about marten?
How big is it? How heavy is a marten?
Between the heaviest marten we've ever caught was 1,800 grams, which is like 2.5 pounds. They're that size. They're skinny little things. Hardly any fat on them. Yeah.
How many martens would you find in a certain area? You've got a package there of 3. That seems unusual. You don't see martens too often in the woods.
No, but I think there's probably more there than you think. They're like I said, they're really hard to count. So you're asking me if I could answer that question, someone would probably pay me $1 million. So I'm going to move on. I feel like what time am I done? We got like 15 minutes, right?
1:45 about.
Okay, I'm going to speed up. So I'm going to move on to our snowshoe hare stuff real quick. So this is sort of where we're at with the stuff we're working on with snowshoe hares. So we did a lot of work assessing track survey methodologies. We looked at, right now, the things we're doing is developing hierarchical models that look at habitat and climate variables at broad landscape scales. So we've got sites where we've estimated occupancy all the way down by Kent County, all the way up to Houghton. There's 133 sites. So we're trying to build some models that look at just sort of at that big, broad scale, teasing out what factors of climate drive occupancy and what factors of forest management drive occupancy. Which is very different than the other stuff we're doing, which is at a very sort of fine scale, which is we're trying to assess association between vital rates in disease, parasites, and hormone stress markers and marten in the eastern UP. And then we're also trying to figure out if we've got this suite of population performance measures, which is like item A, how does that then relate to vegetation characteristics? So these are the sort of like how are we going about doing those things. So we're using fecal DNA to do abundance and density estimates, which is really cool stuff. Genetics has come so far. We literally go out and pick up hair poop all winter and send it to a geneticist, and she figures out, she can identify them down to the individual, which hair that was. And so rather than trying to catch these things and recatch them, we can go walk transects and use pellet recapture, essentially, like here's a pellet from snowshoe hare A, and we caught another one over here, and we caught another one over here. So just the same way we're trying to do abundance estimates by catching marten, we're doing that with snowshoe hare poop, which is pretty cool. The other thing is we're using fecal glucocorticoid metabolites to estimate chronic stress. That's just, cortisol, so looking at cortisol and snowshoe hare pellets that we're collecting out of the traps, the ones we catch. We can look at chronic stress based on that, which is pretty cool stuff. We're also looking at arboviruses and parasites. We're also using I didn't tell you what we're using VHF radio collars for. We're using those to look at mortality. So we're not actually tracking snowshoe hares with radio collars. It'd be pretty boring. They don't go anywhere. Like we had these 15-acre pens we built where we caught hares and collared them to do our abundance estimate or our track survey protocols. And after we opened the pen up and they could go free, they stayed there for 2 years. I'm going anywhere. so they don't. You know, snowshoe hare home range is really small. They don't tend. Taking you gotta use GPS if you really want to understand their movements because they're at a really fine scale. Having a telemetry point from the radio fixed just doesn't give you that scale that you need. Yeah. We're doing a lot of fine scale vegetation estimates, and in 2018 we're going to start putting GPS collars on hares as well as using some landscape scale DNA, fecal DNA stuff. So once again, some key stats. We've captured 32 hares in the last 2 years. We've radio collared over 32 hares. We've captured over 80 at 18 different sites. I didn't tell you what we collected there. We collected hundreds of telemetry locations on these, which is really, all we're using that for is to tell if they're dead or alive. Those collars have a mercury switch in them, essentially, that if the animal hasn't moved for 4 hours, it puts out a different signal. So we just go out and wait till they die, and which they all die out into that. We've conducted over 540 vegetation plots since 2016, collected over 500 fecal pellets to do those abundance estimates last year. There's one PhD dissertation being worked on with that, which is good. And then we've got one master's thesis that's being conducted on the fecal genetic stuff right now. And we've also produced 3 peer-reviewed publications so far on snowshoe hare. I'll run through the trapping process real quick. You can see setting a hare trap is a little bit different than the Marten one. You just kind of throw it out there in the woods and put some apples in it. And we actually use aspen twigs boiled in cinnamon, which is really interesting. An old trapper told us that, and it really works. We've got this custom handling box that we built for hares. They're fine in the trap, but as soon as you start moving them, they kind of beat the hell out of themselves on the wire trap. So we've got this nice soft box with a springy floor in it that we get the hare out and we walk through the woods and that they kind of just spin out on the wood floor in there and they don't beat themselves up. So very, very similar to the way we use isoflurane to anesthetize Marten. You can see this is the actual isoflurane vaporizer and oxygen tank, and that's a snowshoe hare that's under anesthesia right now. And that one, this one here, you can see, you can't really see it on this picture. It's got a radio collar on it, and it's actually up and recovered after the anesthesia process, which usually takes between 10 to 15 minutes, so it's pretty good. So with these, we draw blood from them. We draw it from the lateral venous vein, which is in their hind leg. And if they're over 833 grams, we give them a radio collar. They do, yeah. So what's really interesting is hares they got all sorts of stuff. What's really funny is if you look at all of our techs, they're all handling the Martens with bare hands, and everybody wears gloves with hares, and I'm convinced because hares carry gonorrhea, and it's chlamydia, and I always joke that they just don't want to have to explain, but try to convince their significant other was from the hares they're handling. So just some sort of key things that we found, and this is really astonishing. So the 6-month mortality rate on hares that we captured is 90%. So last year we radio collared 19 hares. By the end of September, they were all dead. So
from what?
What's that?
I say from what? What do you think they died from?
Everything eats hares, and usually when we have a dead collar, we find a collar. You know, there's nothing left. They eat everything, so it's really hard. You know, what actually ate those hares is really hard to say. Very,
Bobcats.
like I said earlier in those slides, everything eats hares from, you know, from red squirrels, foxes, bobcats, you know, avian predators. Everything wants to. It's like the chicken nugget of the woods.
So the remaining 30% would be your responsible for your next generation?
Yeah, you know, so I think
After 6 months, they're not breeding, are they?
they're breeding the next year. So at 1 year of age, they're breeding.
30% or less.
Yeah.
And what's
Yeah, and that's 90% of the hares we collared. So you know what I mean? Like but it's a really high mortality rate. I think at the end of the day, what that's saying, you know, realize that of the ones that we collared, like 50% of the hares we caught were too small to collar. So how many of them make it through the next year? I will say I think one of the things we've seen is I think there's some density dependent factor in snowshoe hare mortality. The hares that are kind of in those crappy sites where we walk in and we're kind of like, we're never going to catch a hare here, and we happen to get one, those ones seem to persist for a really long time. And it's probably because nobody goes to the crappy patch of woods to go hunt hares. Just just like a person's not going to go there to hunt, neither does the animal. They go to places that have high hare densities, which I think really factors into sort of these trying to understand what makes good hare habitat. There may be some factor where really productive systems have really big peaks and spikes in hare abundance, and it's not as high quality if you look at it over a 10-year period as some of the ones that have lower reproductive rates, but hares tend to persist there longer. And so what's really interesting is how does climate factor into those really detailed questions about hare habitat. So home range with hares are between 100 and 200 acres from what we see. Almost do it, like I said, radio telemetry on snowshoe hares. You collar a hare, you go back there the next day. It was under that log today, it was under that bush today, it was over there the next day. You know, they just don't go anywhere. We had one hare in 3 years that moved a mile, which was astonishing. we thought it was dead and it was a mile away, which is, yeah.
Isn't that name then the burying hare?
Same, yeah, yep.
Instead of snowshoe, she's asked what.
Yeah, so
Burying hare.
some people call them varying hares, yeah.
Is
But
that the correct name of one?
it's actually snowshoe hare. And varying hare, so there's snowshoe hares, there's Arctic hares, there's a varying hare is kind of a lay term for all the different hares that switch, coats. So kind of like it's an American marten, not a pine marten, but everybody calls it pine. So, yeah. Once again, conifers are really important to snowshoe hare. We've caught marten we've caught them in the fields out in the sand plains of Rako, where you would think, the nearest tree is 300 yards away. You think, what is this thing doing out there? You never catch a hare in a situation like that. Like, if you walk into a stand and there's not understory and you don't have conifers in there, chances are you're just not going to find a hare. Conifers are really important. Structural, vertical, and horizontal structural complexity is really important to hares. That's not necessarily news. I think every hare hunter knows that when they go try to find hares. Yeah.
What do hares eat? Do they eat the conifers? The seeds?
Yeah, so they do eat conifers. They eat mostly vegetation. Once again, down to the bottom point, snowshoe hare will eat anything. I think we've caught 6 snowshoe hares in marten traps in the last 3 years, and they have all eaten the meat. So, I think the message there is that in the wintertime in the north woods, things are rough and you don't pass up a free meal. It doesn't matter what it is. Everybody's a carnivore and everybody's herbivore in the woods.
I thought in Brimley we used to have a lot of hares. You could see them in the summer, go along. But geez, I haven't seen anything in 40 years, I think.
Yeah.
Keeping-
Well, I'd love to talk to you about things, how things other than hares you think have changed out there. One of the things I'm really interested in. So, the other thing I think is really interesting is 50% of our hares in 2016 tested positive for either Lyme disease exposure or Powassan exposure. And those things are really directly related to climate change. You know, those are viruses that are carried by, you know, the Powassan is that nasty one that they've seen cropping up in Ontario and Maine that is it's a pretty nasty disease that is transmittable to people. And Lyme disease obviously is too. And there's clearly some linkage between those and changing climate regimes, I think. So those interesting take homes, I guess, from the snowshoe hare. Just some parting thoughts. You know, all this stuff is really trying to take all this new technology that's out there for wildlife assessment and really try to understand that relationship between species, climate, and habitat. And I think one of the things you'll see is we do use climate data in our sort of landscape scale occupancy modeling and stuff and those things. But a lot of the stuff is, you know, we're not really looking at climate. We're trying to understand these species and their habitat and how they use it better. And, you know, we know a lot about how climate is projected to impact vegetation. It's really hard to understand how that secondarily affects species that depend on those vegetation communities. And if we're going to be able to do that, we really need to understand those functional linkages between species and their habitat. And so that's really a lot of this work is trying to lay that ground, that baseline foundation for, you know, what is good habitat for these hares or marten, and then how do we, if we want to keep these species around, can we do things to manage these habitats? And I think that stuff's important whether or not you're talking to, you know, we get in all these, I feel like as biologists, ecologists, we get in these situations where we got to dance around whether climate change is real. You know, our EPA administrator says it's not. So, but the point that I want to make is all these things are really about understanding animals and the relationships to vegetation communities, and it doesn't matter what your take on climate change is. It doesn't really matter. You know, all this information is valuable even if you take climate change out of the mix. And understanding these things, forest communities are dynamic. They're always dynamic, whether it's climate driving those, management driving those, or some other type of disturbance driving dynamics in forests. If we don't understand those baseline relationships, it's really hard for us to figure out how do we manage forest species. So, with that, I'll take any more questions, and I figure I'd close with my favorite picture of Marten ever. So cool. Yeah. They're very photogenic. So yeah.
When I think of snowshoe, I think of white cedar wetlands. And if you look at the Forest Service climate modeling for the various tree species, it shows white cedar, not, I presume tamarack too, I don't really know, but you know, kind of being out of here in 100 years or so. Is that an accurate statement? And
well, I think, you know, so all the vegetation impact models I've seen has all of your lowland conifer species, what I would call that boreal suite of species. They're really in trouble, you know, long term. And so, you know, one of the questions that's really important to ask is, can we understand how snowshoe hares, how they use that habitat, and can we manage our way through this, or can we not? Because if we can't, well, all these agencies shouldn't spend millions and millions of dollars trying to manage for snowshoe hares, you know. And so I think these are important questions to ask.
I think climate change is a political decision because of the worldwide problem and the way to attack it. And the argument is we get some blowback, by people who don't believe it's a result of man-made. And if we just, if we try to manage this scenario by moving north or planting trees that might survive, is not a sustainable long-term solution. It is a mediating attempt to deal with it. But as seen by the recent hurricanes, it's going to get worse, and I think we have to face the consequences as soon as we can. We have to manage do what you're doing, no problem with that, but we have to focus on what's causing climate change, and we have to focus on that. And I think that's a reality of us who are worried about the environment. I agree with what you're saying. Climate change is a bigger issue, but it needs to be dealt with.
I couldn't agree more.
We all have to deal with it. We have to get our politics, the EAP guy or whoever that is. He should not be there.
The bottom line is we're going to deal with it whether we like it or not.
Yes, that's right. If there's a hard way or maybe an easier way of doing it. Thank you.
So, Eric, a quick question. You mentioned that your tribe and your work is not in production at the stage and not necessarily legal for lakes. Is there a point where you might make recommendations in terms of management, say trapping or hunting season or something like that? Or is that?
No, yeah. So we do have influence on how species are managed, and for us, for Sault Tribe, we're a little different than the other tribes. Whether or not we have legal co-management over what the state does, for instance, we're 20% of the deer harvesting in the UPEC. We're managing deer whether we have the legal authority to do it or not. Same with Marten. We're 50% of the Marten harvest in the HPP. So what we do in terms of managing those species matters. That being said, one of the things that I've always been a big proponent of is, there's two ways to deal with this. One, you can walk in the room and say, well, we're going to sue you into managing Marten the way that we want you to. Or we can put a whole bunch of data on the table and say, look, this is how we should manage Marten, or this is how we should manage Snowshoe Hare. And I think that's a much more effective way to build consensus around data that everybody agrees on and move forward than trying to press that legal authority to do things.
Any other questions? I really want to thank you. I want to thank the tribe for investing in all of this, and thank you for, Eric obviously is a little more comfortable probably in the woods than in front of a bunch of people, so thank you so much.
I brought a bunch of these. If you want to read in more detail about our Snowshoe Hare work, this sort of lays out in a lot more detail what we're doing. I don't have a convenient document for Marten stuff because it's more scattered, but the Snowshoe Hare stuff is more packaged. So if you guys want to grab one of these, there's plenty of them. Thank you.
Just so everyone knows, there's going to be a short closing thing, a little bit on activism at 3 o'clock. Last for the 15 to 20 minutes. And that was the
I don't know. So one of the